So one thing we got to get into the habit of doing is we got to stop treating charm and charisma as though they are defining characteristics of narcissism. People who are in relationships with covert narcissistic folks or vulnerable narcissistic folks, or just your basic, not really successful or unlikable narcissistic folks, are often confused. Because the toxic person in their life does not have charm, charisma, maybe even not success. And they assume, well, whatever this is, this awfulness, I don't think it's narcissism. But they still have these things with this person in their life. There's very little empathy, there's pathological selfishness, there's entitlement, there's arrogance, there's angry. But they're not as polished or snazzy, as two-faced as what people are believing narcissism is. So let's go back to basics on what narcissism is. I don't think we can have enough reviews on this. It's a personality, so it's consistent. This is not how someone is on just one afternoon on the day they lost their job. This is how they are. And yes, they can turn it off and off in some cases with different people. But regularly these patterns will show up, especially with people where they feel that they've locked in the supply, such as family members or spouses or people who work for them. Now, while some personality styles can be a little flexible, narcissism is maladaptive and rigid and doesn't really change much. So it's even more consistent no matter what you do to try and address the behaviors. It has some fundamental patterns associated with it. Low variable empathy, very little emotional empathy, entitlement and grandiosity, pathological selfishness, and either an excessive need for admiration and validation or the arrogant belief that they deserve lots of admiration and validation and they don't get it. And when they don't get it, they rage and they believe they deserve it. This translates into manipulation, domination, betrayal, rage, passive aggression, and playing the victim when they don't get their way. Things like invalidation, future faking, all of it. Now, nowhere on this list, you'll notice, are charm and charisma. These are qualities that can be present and are often part of the entire love-bombed, confusing picture, but they are not what we call qualifiers for narcissism. Variable empathy, entitlement, arrogance, those things are qualifiers for narcissism. Without that, this is not narcissism. But charm and charisma are not qualifiers. The charm and charisma can make trauma bonding more trauma bonded, right? It can make healing from these relationships tough. The charm and charisma made this an attractive person to you and to the world. They can be perceived as being quite socially successful, which again can make you quite confused. It can be maddening to see them charm and chariz other people and get away with stuff and have people be so charmed by them and then to have them be an asshole to you behind closed doors. It can mean you get less support or you are viewed as the problem. But charm and charisma, again, not a requirement for narcissism. And when the narcissistic person or narcissistic relationship you're in, charm and charisma aren't present, you are more likely dealing with vulnerable, malignant, or even self-righteous narcissism. And in most cases, you are dealing with a sort of a base of vulnerable narcissism. There is so much confusion with these terms, vulnerable narcissist or covert narcissist. So let's just, again, do another review there. Vulnerable narcissism is that sort of victimized, sullen, passive-aggressive, grumbling, socially awkward, aggrieved, can't get along with everyone, failure to launch narcissism. These are often not charming and charismatic folks. They can be a little clunky socially. They may lose jobs because they don't have the slick ability to get along with everyone or be shiny or be Machiavellian and political. They can react to frustration or to not getting their way with either the silent treatment or being loudly rageful. They may not always hold back on their messy rage in front of other people either. Because the sort of shiny social exterior, that charm and charisma we see in grandiose narcissists, is often missing with vulnerable narcissistic people. And you may even feel sorry for them because it feels like that vulnerable narcissistic person, like things really aren't going their way. The trauma bonding here is worse because there is more pity and guilt on your part. And you may not even realize that you are dealing with narcissism. So you may just think you're walking away from a difficult relationship from someone who is struggling, which they may be, rather than walking away from or disengaging from someone who doesn't treat you well, who doesn't respect you, but seems to be doing great in the world, right? Because vulnerable narcissistic people can look sad and anxious and never get going and don't launch, they aren't exactly the life of the party. The other stuff, like the low empathy and the belief that their lives should be easier than other people's lives and that the world is out to get them and the whole witch hunt thing, can get missed as them just being sad or odd or difficult or even just pathetic, rather than all that shiny narcissistic stuff. Then there is this word covert. And this is what really muddies the water, because people are using it to mean lots of things. Some people are using the word covert to mean the narcissistic person who is mean to them, but is so charming with everyone else, or at least normal with everyone else. And the covert, the word covert means hidden part, is that the narcissistic person keeps all their meanness and manipulation and rage and gaslighting under wraps when other people are around. Other people are using covert narcissism to mean the same thing as vulnerable narcissism, meaning that it is less charm and charisma and more grievances and passive aggression. Narcissism researchers take covert to mean the stuff that happens within the narcissist, their thoughts and their feelings, while the overt stuff is what they actually do and say. For example, monopolize the conversation. So you can see this, using this word covert gets messy. Now, the charm and charisma are such a classical part of love bombing and are sort of part of the popular framework of the slick, attractive, superficial, vain, narcissistic person who posts lots of selfies. And as I said, that misses the entire picture. People in relationships with folks who have all the narcissistic bells and whistles, like charm and charisma, are more likely to understand nowadays what they are up against and to be able to start the healing work. But when charm and charisma are viewed as sort of required characteristics, many people in vulnerable narcissistic relationships sort of miss it. And so they don't fully recognize that this is a pattern, which includes the manipulation, the confusion that they are experiencing these relationships. And while more people may see what happens to the people who are in these relationships and what they're experiencing, because vulnerable narcissistic folks are often isolating or may not hold back from being sort of grumpy and sullen or critical in front of other people, there's still confusion with the most common justification people who make for vulnerable narcissistic relationships and people being that they're just going through a tough time. That's why they're kind of being a jerk. Interestingly, instead of charm and charisma, something I do often observe in vulnerable narcissistic folks is that when they're, for example, smart, really smart, that is what kind of has that charm and charisma effect. If the vulnerable person is really smart about something, it can often lead people to excuse their difficult behavior. Yeah, I know, he can be a handful, he just speaks his mind, but he's a financial genius. But I didn't forget those other types, malignant and self-righteous. Malignant narcissistic folks are also not always charming and charismatic. They can be sort of bullyish and controlling feeling from the beginning, a little bit scary. A person excusing the malignant narcissistic person's behavior may view it as a take charge kind of style. And in people who may be more vulnerable to coercion, for example, when there's a big power difference between the malignant narcissistic person and the person getting into the relationship, or in people who may not have lots of support, or who have experienced other unresolved relational betrayals and traumas, right? Then there may be a sort of capitulation, a giving in to the control of the malignant narcissist because they just don't have the supports, and the coercion is such psychological manipulation. With self-righteous narcissistic folks, again, they're often not also charming and charismatic, but they may be very responsible, upstanding, hardworking, religious, organized, things that we may view as virtues, and may lead us to miss that these self-righteous folks are also very judgmental, invalidating, critical, rigid, morally superior. Or when they are like this, we may view it as being a part of our failings because we're a little messy, or sometimes we sleep in, or maybe we eat candy in bed, or maybe I'm just talking about myself. So narcissist as leader, narcissist as selfie-posing, Instagram-obsessed friend, narcissist as love-bombing cheater, narcissist as sports car driving show-off, maybe, but not always. That superficial surface stuff makes it hard for some folks because it can make the relationship more enticing and create one kind of trauma bond. But when these other non-charm charisma types show up, you may miss the toxic patterns: entitlement, variable empathy, low empathy, pathological selfishness, that excessive need for admiration and validation, or the arrogance and anger about not getting it. The trauma bond may be embedded in the guilt around leaving someone who's sort of pathetic, or the fear around someone who is scary. Narcissism is nuanced, it's complex, and it's tricky. It's like a toxic box of candy where all of the pieces of candy look the same, but may taste different based on what is in the middle. So while one person may be eating a charming, charismatic, betraying, invalidating, grandiose, entitled bonbon, you may be nibbling on an angry, aggrieved, smart, entitled, socially anxious caramel. Don't get lost in the idea of they aren't charming and charismatic, or they are like this in front of other people. They're angry and ragey in front of other people, so it can't be narcissism. Narcissism is about the patterns, public or private, drizzled in charm and charisma or not. And why does this matter? Because understanding this can break you out of self-blame, self-doubt, confusion cycles, and help you radically accept, maintain realistic expectations, and disengage, and ultimately to heal.